Thank you so much, and my apology about starting a little late with some of the technical things we needed to arrange. As we are speaking in lovely Columbus, Ohio, probably many of the people in the audience are familiar, and possibly very familiar, with Angelo Mosillo, the founder of Nationwide Financial. And as you may know, as way back as 2006, he coined the term toxic assets, which later on became quite well known, quite in use in various circles. The reason that I am borrowing his toxic asset term and applying it to code is because I am getting more and more alarmed about the amount of technical debt in various engagements that I am involved in. And actually, I am of fairly strong conviction that many of the lessons that we learned in the subprime loan crisis are quite applicable to the business of developing software, and particularly to developing good software as distinct from toxic code. So I will spend a little bit of time about the metaphor, as the metaphor of toxic code, together with the metaphor of technical debt, has more to it than catches the eye. I will move on to get into the business of how do you measure technical debt. Namely, it's one thing to talk about I have some technical debt, and quite a different thing to be able to measure it in a way that you can use it as part of your risk models or process control, etc. We'll move on to speak about how do you govern it. And I would present two models to do the governance. And finally, I will conclude with a few steps that everyone here could start doing tomorrow morning in the office if the ideas presented here make good sense to you. Now, take a look at the various metaphors that are given in this slide. The first one is by Ward Cunningham, talking about technical debt. And in his view, technical debt was about borrowing time. Namely, there are good and valid reasons why we need to ship towards a certain date. The reasons could be early customer feedback, the reason could be better cash flow, or any one of other related reasons. And what we do, we borrow time by doing some design or coding or testing shortcuts, get the product out the door, and then go back to the software to pay back the debt, to do the things that we did in a hurry in a more rigorous manner. So the fundamental notion here is that of borrowing time and then paying it back. Now, if you just take a look at various phrases in the English language that we all use, like I wasted my time, or time is money, etc., there is a clear association between the notion of time and the notion of money. So one interesting way to look at technical debt is to equate it with the amount of money that it takes to pay it back. So let's say I borrowed a week of time through technical debt, and I need after release to pay it back by spending a time fixing various things. And let's say that a week of mine is $5,000, then I have a technical debt of $5,000 on the product that was just released. Now, $5,000 on a reasonable project and product would not be considered much. Namely, okay, you spend a week Israel, you fix the code, and we move on. However, the situation, as I indicated, that I witness more and more, is the technical debt gets accrued and gets piled up to the extent that it is becoming very, very significant. And in a way, you can think about it like the quote here from Angelo Mosello about the ratio between the value of something and the debt on the same thing. So you may have a notion of the value of the software you're developing, for example, the net present value of the software. And if you compare it to something like technical debt, and you're in the situation that the technical debt actually exceeds the expected value, you need to ask yourself the question, does it make any good sense? I would contend that at this situation, when the technical debt is equal or exceeds the value, you have toxic code on your hands. And furthermore, as just about any code is being used by other systems, you actually have something which is equivalent to financial instruments when an asset is packaged with some other assets in order to change its characteristics. So the fact that you have a piece of code in a toxic state is actually quite contagious because the other systems working with it may be of much higher quality. However, during the interactions, malfunctions in the toxic code can affect the systems that use it. So the thing is quite serious at times, and I will bring various examples to how serious is or how toxic is. But before that, let me speak about two ways in which technical debt get accrued. One is an explicit decision, and sometimes the explicit decision is not being said so, but is being practiced as a resource allocation strategy. And for example, I was in a recent engagement where I was pretty mystified by the lack of any unit test coverage. And the answer that I have gotten about why so was basically we have no time to waste here on doing unit test management. Anyway, you do functional testing, this should be sufficient. So there is one form of technical debt which is an explicit decision, I am not going to put resources on it, or I'm not going to put enough resources on it, etc. There are two forms, however, which are implicit. The first one is a business of the ongoing pressure to get additional features and functions into the market. So when I borrow the week of debt, I, of course, have the good intention after the release to go back and refactor the code and do the rest of the stuff that every one of us would do. But the situation in terms of the business pressures is such that I need to do this feature and I need to do that feature and so on and so forth. And oftentimes, even with the best intentions on earth, I never manage to scrape together a week to pay back my debt. And the same is true of the person next to me and my other colleague, etc. So what happens, we wanted to do it, but circumstantially, we were never able to go and refactor the code. There is another source for accrual of technical debt, which is software decay. And it's not really different in any way from, let's say, some metal corroding on you. Software is a compound object. Every compound object in nature is subject over time to loss of its structure and as a result to decay. So what happens, unless the team is very, very good on pushing back on software decay, over time, the quality of the software deteriorates. You can think about it actually as the business of flossing your teeth. If I forget tonight to floss my teeth, but go back to it tomorrow morning, no biggie. However, if I were not to floss my teeth for 100 days, probably an appointment or two with a dentist could be expected. Now, the phenomenon of software decay is described in the following chart. What you have here is the years from the time of release. We released a software product at this point in time, and the years went by, 1, 2, 3, etc. What you have on the vertical axis is the cost of change. And what the graphs show is the cost of change, how it evolves, or actually how it deteriorates over time. If you are very, very good on pushing back on your technical debt, then your optimal cost of change will be growing, but it will be growing slowly. If, however, you are neglecting the pushing back on the technical debt and possibly accruing more of it, it goes up in an exponential manner. And what happens is that when it grows it this way, everything that you try to do to the code, let's say fix a bug, is problematic. And it's actually problematic to the extent that when you try to do something, you might break something else and get into difficult periods of trying to maintain it. What happens, of course, in terms of your responsiveness to your customer is that your responsiveness goes down the drain because you are not sure-footed. You cannot go and work quickly in the code and fix it. You need more time because of the risks that you broke something else and because of the need to test it more than you would normally have liked to, and I will exemplify some numbers in a minute. So after some years, when you find yourself on the right-hand side of this graph, you don't really have good options, because if you continue as is, the technical debt continues to grow on you, and things are becoming more and more difficult. The other strategy that you have is to say, well, I'm done with this code, I'm going to acquire company XYZ and use their product instead. And while this has been known to happen pretty often, you run into the problem of two code bases in parallel. Namely, the new software that you bought has its own customers. You have your own customers. You need to migrate the two code bases into a single code base. And until you do it, you are running with keeping, maintaining, and developing two code bases. So the option of I will start afresh is being exercised, but it has its own costs. Finally, you have the third option, which is to start refactoring your code in earnest and to reduce, if not eliminate, the technical debt. And the issue here is that you need to find a way for this activity to be fully funded. So, for example, if you were to go to the business and say, I am gonna reduce my new function feature by 25%, and I will use the money I save this way to reduce my technical debt, probably you will have a very interesting discussion about we can't afford this release to be with less functionality, etc., etc., etc. So the situation is such that once you are here, you don't really have any good option. You do one of the third options out of necessity, but none of them is really too attractive. Now, here is an example as to how much things can deteriorate through software decay and accrual of technical debt. The situation described here is as follows. You have a program with 1,000 bugs, or starting with 1,000 bugs here. And Jerry Weinberg, from whom this data is taken, has run 3 simulations. First simulation, second simulation, and third simulation. As you see, the time to completion of all those simulations varies drastically, and the simulations only differ from one another in the error feedback ratio. What is the error feedback ratio? We talked about the risks of breaking something when I am fixing something in the code. And let's say when I fix 10 bugs in the code, if I break 5, I have an error feedback ratio of 0.5.